Hello, Year 6. I am going to be reading the next part of Dead Man's Cove, Chapter 8. Quite a lot's happened to Laura, hasn't it? And there's certainly something very odd going on in St Ives. So let's see if we can find out a little bit more about it now. "If it all ends in tears, don't say I didn't warn you," said Mrs Crabtree, materialising from behind a bush as Laura returned from school on Thursday. Laura blinked. Her neighbour was wearing pink rubber gardening gloves, a purple scarf, and a fake fur coat patterned with horizontal orange and black stripes. She looked like an exotic, oversized bumblebee. Laura put her bag on Mrs Crabtree's wall and covered her mouth to hide a yawn. It had been 1 a.m. before she had fallen asleep, and it hadn't helped that Mr Gilbert's lessons that morning had seemed especially boring. "What will end in tears?" Said Mrs Crabtree, "Mr Mukhtar's not going to take kindly to his boy going off gadding about the hills and beaches with you when he should be minding the store. Likes his afternoons off, does Mr Mukhtar. When else is he going to do his wheeling and dealing with the fancy tapestries? Bringing a lot more money than a can of baked beans, they do. He's not going to like it if you put a spanner in the works just because you want a playmate." "How do you know all this stuff?" demanded Laura. "Have you got the seagulls spying for you?" "For your information, Mrs Mukhtar herself suggested Tarek come for a walk with me. She practically forced him out of the door." Mrs Crabtree produced some shears from a pocket in her coat and began aggressively snipping her plants. "That's Mrs Mukhtar. It's her husband you need to worry about." Laura hopped onto the stone wall and sat with her back to the street and cemetery, watching twigs and dead flower heads fly beneath Mrs Crabtree's nimble fingers. Overhead, the wheeling gulls cried. Under normal circumstances, Laura couldn't bear people who gossiped, but right now her neighbour seemed to be the only person in her life willing or able, she thought of Tarek's silence, to answer questions. "Are the Mukhtars popular?" she asked. "In the community, I mean. Do people like them?" Mrs Crabtree straightened up, wincing. She massaged the small of her back with one hand. "The Mukhtars? They're pillars of society in St Ives. They moved here a couple of years ago and took over the North Star grocery. Him in all his finery and her looking like a movie star. And you'd think the royal family had come to town. Right away they were welcomed with open arms because, from the get-go, Mr Mukhtar was a model citizen. Always the first to put his hand in his pocket if there was a community fundraiser. Still is, by the way. Plus, the North Star is one of the cheapest and best stocked stores in town. Such wonderful fresh produce." "Is Tarek their only child?" prompted Laura before Mrs Crabtree could get started on the virtues of the Mukhtar's vegetables. "Well now, that's just it," said Mrs Crabtree, resuming her pruning. "He's not, is he?" Laura stared at her. "Not what?" "Not their child." "So he's adopted?" "Oh, well, I don't know the ins and outs of that. Only that he's the son of her sister who died. He came all the way from India. Must have been 9 months ago. Looking even more emaciated than he does now, all rough and ready and not speaking English. That's why Mrs Mukhtar's has to take time away from her manicures to teach him at home. But from day one, Tarek always had impeccable manners. Such a nice boy." Laura's mind was whirling. Tarek's mum was dead and he was all alone in the world. He'd been brought to a strange place to live with strangers. That's why he looked so lost. That's why she felt so drawn to him. They were the same. "There's one thing I don't understand," she said. "If the Mukhtars are so respected in St Ives, why are you telling me I should be worried about Mr Mukhtar? Don't you trust him?" Mrs Crabtree tossed the shears into a nearby bucket and removed her pink gloves. "To be truthful, I'm not a fan of either of the Mukhtars, even if they do sell the best produce in town. Well, it's that poor sad boy, isn't it? He's a reflection of the things that aren't being said. He's a reflection of what's going on behind closed doors. Mrs. Crabtree had done no more than confirm Laura's suspicions about Mr. Mukhtar, but she thought it wise to avoid antagonising the man unnecessarily. For the remainder of that third week in St. Ives, she stayed away from the North Star, because each time she ventured anywhere near it, Mr. Mukhtar seemed to be in residence. From her sheltered position on the balcony of the holiday flats opposite, Laura could make out his shadowed bulk through the salt-speckled window of the store. The slim frame of Tarek appeared only rarely. Once she'd disturbed two seagulls, and Mr. Mukhtar had been alerted by their screams. Without warning, he'd pressed his face flat against the window and stared menacingly in her direction. Laura was well hidden, but her heart skipped a beat. It was as if he could see through concrete. She glared at the departing birds. She had been joking when she'd asked Mrs. Crabtree if she had seagulls spying for her. But it wasn't such a far-fetched idea. It was uncanny how much her neighbour seemed to know. But Laura had told herself Mrs. Crabtree didn't know everything. She hadn't known about Jay, for instance, although her ears had pricked up when Laura asked her if she had ever heard of anyone with the initial J living or visiting number 28 while Calvin Redfern had been in residence. Is there some mystery about this person? Oh, I do love an intrigue, she had said. Laura had been saved from answering by the arrival of Mrs. Crabtree's sister. She planned to heed her neighbour's advice and continued to stay away from Mr. Mukhtar, but she had no intention of staying away from Tarek. Not now she knew he was alone in the world, except for the Mukhtars. Not now she was even more certain that he needed a friend. But there was to be no repeat of their afternoon at the island and splashing in the surf of Porthwooden Beach. As winter gave way to spring in St. Ives, Mrs. Mukhtar never again offered to mind the store so that Tarek and Laura could enjoy the sunshine. Mostly, Laura just hung around in the cool half-light of the North Star as Tarek served customers or stacked shelves. If there were people in the store, she'd sit quietly on one side of the counter until they were gone. But the tourists had not arrived yet, with their surfboards and broods of children clamouring for Cornish pasties and ice creams, and much of the time business was slow. Those were the afternoons Laura loved best. She'd tell Tarek stories about Sylvan Meadows, or complain about Kevin Rutledge. When she read aloud to him from her Matt Walker books, Tarek seemed completely entranced. Sometimes she wondered how much he took in. She found it peculiar that he seemed to understand English, but not speak a word, beyond her name or the occasional hello. Not that it bothered her. To her, the most important thing was that, as she read to him or chatted about her day, the tension seemed to melt from his thin shoulders. What's more, she could feel the same thing happen to her. Their friendship might have been an unconventional one, but it made her smile. She felt a bond with Tarek. For the first time in her life, she had a best friend. Often, she had the feeling that he was bursting to talk to her. He'd open his mouth and appear to be on the verge of saying something, but he'd always clamp it closed again. The shutters in his amber eyes would descend once more. He'd be standing right in front of her, but she could tell that he had mentally retreated, like a sea creature withdrawing to its shell. If it weren't for Mr. and Mrs. Mukhtar, who were constantly checking up on Tarek like two circling guard dogs scenting danger, thereby restricting Laura's visits to once or twice a week, life would have been close to perfect. One afternoon, Laura was helping Tarek unpack some boxes of vegetables and thinking how exhausted he looked, as if he hadn't slept for days, when his sleeve slipped back and she saw purple bruises on his arm. "Tarek! What happened?" she cried. "Who did that? Did somebody hit you?" Instantly, she thought of Mr. Mukhtar. If he could strike Tarek for helping to stop a dogfight, what else might he be capable of? Tarek leapt to his feet and shook his head vigorously. He pointed at the stairs at the back of the shop, which led to the Mukhtar's living quarters, an area to which Laura had never been invited, and he performed a funny mime of falling down the steps. Laura didn't believe him, but she could hardly call him a liar. She was trying to decide what to say or do when Mrs. Mukhtar wafted in on a cloud of perfume. Judging by the shopping bags, she'd been on a spree. Her gold bangles jingled as she pointed at the vegetables on the store floor and said, "Tarek, my boy, you are not on holidays now. Your father is on his way. I suggest you say goodbye to your friend and get this mess cleaned up before he arrives." She gave Laura one of her special white smiles that never quite reached her eyes. "So nice to see you again, Laura," she cooed. "I hope it's not too long before you can visit us again. Our best to Mrs. Webb. Safe trip home." So, that's the end of chapter 8. The Mukhtars certainly are hiding something, aren't they? They are acting strange. I wonder what it is. Make sure that you check back on the YouTube channel to watch Mrs. Brackley and listen to her read chapter 9 of the story.